the glory of the British Empire or anything like that. They're just there to make a buck in the best way they know how to do, and that's by killing people very efficiently. Now, they were from different parts of Germany. They weren't all from one place, but they were mostly from a principality called Hesse-Kassel. But again, some came from other principalities, but because the majority were from Hesse-Kassel, the Americans just lumped all the Germans into one category and called them Hessians. As we've already touched on, they had a reputation as fierce, disciplined, professional fighters. And just for fun, because I'm obsessed with facial hair, I think I'll mention the fact that they had long mustaches.
That's fair. I studied the Ottoman Empire. Half of that history is about people's different mustaches. So let the mustache facts come. Absolutely.
Yeah. So that was kind of their, what would you say? Their mark of distinction, their calling card, their mustaches when 99% of men at the time were clean shaven, or at least were supposed to be. And these Hessians made up as much as 1/3 of the British forces. So there's quite a few of them there. And as Scott already touched upon, Americans, Scott, you talked about what the British told the Hessians about what the Americans would do, but the Americans had the same opinion as the Hessians. The Americans considered them as barbaric thugs, just like Huns almost. I think of how the Americans called the Germans Huns in World War I and World War II. So I don't know that they used that term back then. I haven't heard of it, but same idea. Like these guys are going to, rip your head off and show it to you as you die. Well, I guess that's impossible, but you get the idea. Rip your heart out and show it to you as you die, or something like that. I don't know. I just made that up. But interestingly enough, though, this is an interesting fact I ran across. Hessians had a tendency to just disappear and just to melt into the wilderness and start a new life in the Americans. So I think some of them, Scott, the reason they came over was not just the paycheck, but a chance at a new life. They thought, I'll go fight a battle or two, and then I'll just disappear.
Yeah, and they're also very good at desertion. Let's not take that away from them.
Yeah, so they're professional deserters as well as professional fighters. And after the war, this is getting ahead, but I just thought I'd mention it. 5,000 to 6,000 of them stayed in the United States. So I think quite a few people, I can't prove this, but it would seem reasonable to assume that quite a few people today of German descent may be descended from a Hessian. So that's kind of an interesting thought, isn't it?
Yeah, very reasonable.
Now, specifically in Trenton, the Hessians had 1,500 men, and their commander was a fellow named Colonel Johann Rall. And Rall and the Hessians knew the Americans were there. They weren't blind, deaf, and dumb. I mean, they knew there were Washington. In fact, they were put there to kind of keep an eye on Washington and his army. But they didn't pay a lot of attention to them. Listen to what Johann Rall, this is what he wrote. He said, "We don't need trenches or fortifications. The rebel soldiers, those country clowns, they are almost naked, dying of cold. They have no provisions or blankets. Let them come. We shall welcome them with our bayonets." And that, of course, falls into the category of be careful what you wish for, because you just might get it. So that's extreme arrogance on the part of the Hessian commander. He was certainly right about them being almost naked, dying of cold, no provisions or blankets. That was essentially correct. But calling them country clowns, that's just a little bit arrogant. And we don't need trenches or fortifications. Well, why don't we just see if that turns out to be true or not? All right. So as we mentioned, it's Christmas Day, and the Hessians were celebrating Christmas with much food and drink, and most of them, or if not all of them, fell into a sound sleep. Now, I do want to put one thing to rest here. If you read older books, or if you watch older documentaries and stuff, they'll say that when the Americans arrived, the Hessians were all drunk or hungover. Most scholars would not subscribe to that today. They would say, no, they weren't drunk. They weren't necessarily hungover, but they were just asleep. I mean, if you show up at somebody's door at 4 or 5 in the morning, chances are for most people, they're going to be asleep. So they probably weren't drunk. They probably weren't hungover. But on the other hand, we can't say, these are Germans, for crying out loud. We can't say they hadn't had quite a bit of beer. So they're not really going to be in the absolute, even though they're not just fallen over drunk, or they're not hopelessly hungover, they're still not in the great the greatest situation or the greatest state to be fighting a battle.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
Let's give them enough credit that they could have consumed a lot but still be in fighting shape if they've built up enough tolerance over the years. Mm-hmm. So one account I read that covers this is, like you said, contrary to the myth, it's not as if the Americans arrived to complete silence and people are asleep on the street. There was some preparation, but it wasn't sufficient. And once again, the Americans, there really is weather on their side. And you'll talk more about this in a second, James. Rall did establish outposts around Trenton to give him early warning of an attack. They were aware that this could happen. And these weren't small outposts either. For one example, the contingent at the Fox Chase Tavern at the edge of Trenton had 73 men. And at the Crosswicks Creek Drawbridge, there was 100 men. But despite all that, Rall didn't fortify his main position in Trenton. He thought that his men could turn out rapidly when they were warned by warning shots and defeat any Patriot force against them. So there were preparations, but we're going to see how sufficient they were. That's my little 2 cents there.
That's important. Piggybacking on the idea that the Hessians were not completely oblivious to what was going on. I've read in a couple of sources that somebody actually handed Colonel Rall at one point a note saying, "Hey, there may be an American attack. We need to prepare." And he didn't even read it. He just stuck it in his pocket. Probably said, "Yeah." So who knows how things might have gone had he actually thought to open that up. But his attitude was just say, "Don't mess with me right now." All right. So here is this planned crossing of the Delaware. Let's talk about that for a minute. Crossing, as I've alluded to before, now we're going to talk about it some more. The crossing would be very dangerous. Number one, you had to bring a couple thousand guys across the river in many small boats that could only hold, 15, 20, maybe tops guys. You had to bring horses across. Keep in mind, never forget everyone, but we're long before mechanized warfare. So everything that's really, really heavy and that has to be pulled, it has to be pulled by an animal, usually horses. You had to bring artillery across. Our cannons are extremely heavy and other equipment as well. So all that had to be ferried across the river. And just think about it. If you're too noisy, if let's say a cannon or a musket accidentally goes off. Well, that would alert the Hessians and they might come over, and you do not want to be in boats when the other side comes up with muskets and cannon.
Yes.
You are sitting duck like the
on top
saying,
of an icy river.
Fish in a barrel. Yeah, I haven't even mentioned the ice yet. It was Christmas Day. It's really cold in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. The river was full of large chunks of ice. So assuming you're able to maintain silence and you don't alert the Hessians and have them come over and just shoot you like sitting ducks, your boats might run into big chunks of ice and get a hole in them and you sink. And also the weather was really bad. Once again, the weather just doesn't seem to want to cooperate with these attacks these days, does it? It was bad. There was rain. There was snow. So it was an absolutely extremely hazardous, extremely dangerous crossing. And I want to take just a second and briefly talk about the famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, which everybody, or at least most history fanatics and most Americans have seen. It's the famous, we'll have to put this up on the website, Scott. I'll send you a copy of it later, but you know which one I'm talking about.
Right. It makes you think that Washington and only 10 other soldiers personally defeated the Hessians. It's just that one boat.
Yeah, it shows 3 boats, but you see Washington standing up, boldly standing there, defying all odds while other people are rowing. And then there's a guy behind him holding the American flag who's supposedly James Monroe. More on James Monroe later. But it's completely historically inaccurate. The sides of the boats would have been much higher. They would have been, and everybody would have been standing up instead of these. You wouldn't have all these people sitting. I picture the Higgins boats from World War II. These are not exactly like that, but they're boats where the sides are high enough and they're deep enough for people to be standing. You wouldn't have all these guys sitting, and you'd have the sides high enough to protect your body so you wouldn't be totally exposed like Washington is in the photo. What am I saying? Photo in the I wish we had a photo of it, but that would make our job a little easier. But it's a painting, and it wasn't even done till 1851. So the painting has its own history, and I don't want to go into too much detail about that. But the painting is as symbolic and didactic as it is trying to capture what actually happened.
And it's not a good strategy for your commander-in-chief to be standing up at the head of the boats with sharpshooters on the other side. Not a great plan.
Yeah, who knows who's going to be there waiting, and right next to the flag too. You might as well put a neon sign. Well, they didn't have them, but if they did, here I am, George. All right, moving along. Just so we're putting aside that painting, great painting, love it. It's fun, but not accurate. All right, the plan was to get across the river during the night and to be in Trenton, as I mentioned, before daybreak on the 26th. But just as almost always happens with every military operations, there are delays. As I mentioned, the weather was horrible. There were other logistical issues. And so the crossing was delayed for several hours. The last soldiers did not get across the river until 3 a.m., which is way behind schedule, which meant they weren't going to get to Trenton until after daylight had already dawned and several hours into the day. So that's really bad for the Americans. And I just want to mention something I think is really cool. The password for the operation was victory or death. And I think Washington chose that to kind of motivate his troops, but at the same time strike fear into them, realizing, guys, we've got to win this or else. There's no retreat. There's no surrender, none of that. We're going to win or we're going to die. So I thought that was pretty cool.
It's pretty on the nose. He knows how to handle messaging and slogans. I want to mention, too, what James talked about earlier, the three-prong attack. This is just one of the three prongs. And what's also happening at the same time with this complex plan, there's the main attack going on, composed of two columns under Nathaniel Greene and John Sullivan of about 2,400 troops and 18 cannon. They'd cross the Delaware 9 miles north of Trenton. Then a second assault would be made across the river at the Trenton Ferry by 700 Pennsylvania militiamen under James Ewing to seize the bridge that James talked about. And the third party, led by John Collider, would cross at Bristol. But we're going to see that it's not as clean as that. So anyway, let's go back to Trenton. So what's happening at Trenton?
Yeah. Washington doesn't know this, but as we mentioned earlier, the two other prongs, not the one that Washington was leading personally, but the other two, they don't get the job done. Although, well, one of them partly gets it done, but it's pretty much Washington and his 2,000, 2,400 or so, or else. So the Americans with the 2,400 guys, they marched towards Trenton. They began at 4 a.m., just 1 hour after everybody had gotten across. As they marched, many left trails of blood from their bleeding feet. A lot of these men had literally no shoes left, or if they did, the shoes had holes in them, and some of these guys are in their bare feet, walking across snow, not fun. When they got to 2 miles outside the town, the soldiers were startled by the sudden appearance of 50 armed men. All of a sudden, poof, here's 50 men armed. That wasn't part of the plan. But as it turned out, they were American. And this small group had actually attacked a Hessian outpost earlier. Washington was not happy to hear this, because he thought that they would have been put on guard. In other words, these 50 guys blew his cover. They spoiled the surprise. And Washington, in a rare instance of him losing his temper, we talked earlier about how he had a ferocious temper, but he was good at keeping it under control. But here he loses it, and he says, you, sir, may have ruined all my plans by having put them on their guard. You can imagine the poor guys. I'm sorry. Yeah, man. But as it turns out, they actually did just the opposite. The 50 men who attacked the Hessian outpost actually helped Washington and contributed to the sense of surprise. Why, you say? Well, it's because, as we mentioned earlier, Rall had been warned and had hints about a possible American attack. And so he thought this group of 50 men that attacked the outpost, he thought that was the attack. So when they fought off the 50 men and the 50 men disappeared, Rall probably thought, oh, that was it. All right, we fought them off.